Hello, and welcome to People of the Pod, brought to you by American Jewish Committee. Each week, we take you beyond the headlines to help you understand what they all mean for America, Israel, and the Jewish people. I'm your host, Manya Brachear Pashman. On May 21st, Sarah Milgrim and Yaron Lischinsky were murdered outside the Capitol Jewish Museum in Washington, D.C., following the Young Diplomats Reception hosted annually by American Jewish Committee. Yaron returned to his home in Israel to be buried on Sunday. Sarah's funeral in Kansas City took place on Tuesday. AJC CEO Ted Deutch was there and is with us now to talk about this incredibly sad and significant loss for the Jewish community. Really, for the world. Ted, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Manya.
So, Ted, I have to ask, where were you when you heard the news of what happened?
Well, I had been in Washington with the team there. I had done meetings in the Capitol. I've had some meetings in Atlanta. I flew to Atlanta, and there were some questions as I was flying, but it wasn't until I landed that it was clear what had happened. And the rest of the night on into the morning, obviously, we're all completely tied up trying to address the crisis and make sure that everything was being addressed for our people, for those who were there, with law enforcement, with the administration. It was a really, really horrible, horrible night.
This was an annual reception for Young Diplomats. What was the theme of the event this year, though? Was it different from years past?
The theme was humanitarian diplomacy, which is the cruel irony here. This brutal, violent terror attack came immediately after a big group of young leaders from across Washington came together, AJC leaders, Jewish leaders, young diplomats, literally young diplomats from across the diplomatic corps, all came together to focus on how to bring people together to provide humanitarian assistance, ultimately to make life better for everyone, for Jews and Muslims and Christians, for Israelis and Arabs, Palestinians, everyone coming together with this sense of hope. And then that was, of course, followed with the despair that we felt immediately after as a result of this tragedy.
Given the climate since October 7th, given the rise in anti-Semitism and the virulence of a lot of the protests, was this predictable, sadly, or was it really unimaginable?
Strangely, I think both of those things can be true. It was, on the one hand, absolutely predictable. We've been saying since before October 7th, but certainly since we've seen these horrific protests and people chanting to globalize the Intifada and Palestine from the river to the sea and calling for the destruction of Israel and the attacks against Jews on the streets, we've been saying that words can lead to violence. We've seen this happen. We've seen it happen throughout our history. We've seen it happen across Europe. And we've seen the kind of deadly violence here in the United States at Tree of Life and Poway and elsewhere. And so on the one hand, completely predictable. At the same time, unimaginable. How is it that a group of dedicated young Jewish leaders and their allies from around the world could come together in a Jewish museum to focus on the hope for a better future for everyone and be a target for a brutal, vicious, anti-Semitic killer? And that's the point we've been trying to make since, is that sure, that incitement, that words aren't just words because they can lead to violence, but also that we shouldn't live in a place where we just expect that the Jewish community is always going to be under threat. That's not normal. It's not normal in the United States. It shouldn't be normal anywhere.
What have you learned about Yaron and Sarah since last Wednesday?
I have. Yaron was a partner of AJC and a lot of work, but among the many messages that I received since last Wednesday, There was a really touching message from a diplomat, from an ambassador in Washington, who had just recently met with a group of hostage families, I should say, that Yaron brought to them, and he wanted to share how meaningful it was, and in particular the care that Yaron showed for these families who have been struggling now, as we're recording this, 600 days. I thought that was really meaningful to hear from someone who had only recently spent considerable time with him. In Sarah's case, I just got back from her funeral in Shiva in Kansas City, and I learned a lot. And I had met her before, but I didn't know a fraction of the ways that she's made so many meaningful contributions to her community in Kansas City, to the work that she's done in all of the jobs that she's had, to the incredible work that she's done at the embassy in Washington, working to go out into the community to groups, in particular, groups that included people who had ostracized her because of her strong positions. And when she took this job at the Israeli embassy and worked to bring people together and to build bridges in all of these different communities across Washington and around the country, really, really meaningful. We knew that both of them, I've said this a lot, and you can tell even just from the photo, they're a beautiful couple and they really represented the best of us. But when you hear her rabbis, her friends, her family talk about all that Sarah really was, it's a really, really tremendous loss. And there's this feeling in Kansas City, there was this feeling in the synagogue yesterday, which was, of course, filled to overflowing, that everyone there felt invested in Sarah's life, her development, her success, the impact that she's had on the Jewish community and the world. And everyone felt the loss personally. And it really speaks to the way that we've all reacted to this. The more that we get to know about Sarah and Yaron, the more we understand just how dramatic a tragedy this really was.
You know, your story about Yaron bringing the hostage families together just is heartbreaking, because I just can't imagine the pain that's amplified now for those families, having met and worked with Yaron, and now this.
Manya, among the most powerful messages that we've received since last week were the many messages from the hostage families that we at AJC have gotten to know so well now for 600 days, because of all of the times that we've spent with them and getting to know them and trying to lift up their voices with leaders in Washington and around the world, to think about what they have experienced, the loss that some of them have felt, the tragedy of knowing that their loved ones are gone, but being unable to bury them and have closure. And yet, the decency and the humanity to reach out to express their sadness over these losses. It's just really, really powerful. Also, not in the Jewish community, but along those same lines. I mean, as you know, when I was in Congress, I got to know many of the families who lost loved ones in the school shooting in Parkland. And after spending a lot of time with them and trying to be there for them, it's just unbelievable to me the number of those families who almost immediately reached out to see if there's anything they could do.
Oh, wow. Wow. That's amazing. That encounter you had with gun violence that took other young lives, how was that experience similar to this one, and how is it very different?
Well, I've actually been thinking about this a lot. And the greatest similarity is really beyond the sadness, obviously, which is profound. It's the outrage. In the case of Parkland, it's the fact that students went to school that day, to a place that should be safe, and never returned to their families, that their school became the most dangerous place they could have been. And last Wednesday, for Sarah and Yaron, they were with peers, friends, leaders in the Jewish community and beyond in a hopeful setting, talking about the way to address suffering, really the best of what we would want anyone, especially our young people, to be spending their time on. And this was the most dangerous place for them. And ultimately, when the event ended and they walked outside, they lost their lives as well. And the world that we live in which both of those things happen, that's what I've really struggled with.
We're all struggling with this. What is the takeaway? How do we find any glimmer of hope in any of this?
Well, Rachel Goldberg-Polin, we had all heard her say over and over that hope is mandatory for the hostages. Look, I think for where we go as a Jewish people, hope is also mandatory, but hope alone isn't enough. We have work to do. If we're going to come through this as a community that is different and frankly safer and living in a world which is different than the one that we live in now, then we have to honor Sarah and Yaron's lives by making this conversation different than it normally is. Yes, we have to focus on increasing security and making sure that the community is safe. But if the only thing that we're doing is talking about how to get more money for security and police officers with bigger guns and metal detectors and turning our synagogues and day schools and JCCs into fortresses, some of that is necessary at this moment. But we have to change the conversation so that no one thinks that it's normal in America for Jews to be the only group that has to think about how they represent a target just by being together. That has to change. It's not just about making people care about anti-Semitism and fighting anti-Semitism and acknowledging the tragic loss of life. That has happened. The messages from the highest levels of government from around the United States, from around the world, so much sympathy, and it's important. But as I told one governor yesterday, I am grateful for the additional security that you'll be providing, but there is so much more than that in terms of changing this conversation, the conversation about why it's not normal for Jews to be afraid, why we have to recognize once and for all that calls for globalizing the Intifada are not the calls of a social justice movement. They're the calls of a terrorist movement. We have to understand that when people decide that because of something that's happening in Gaza, that they're going to protest outside of synagogues and they're going to vandalize Jewish-owned restaurants and they're going to get on the subway in New York and they're going to march in other places and they're going to accost Jews, that can't be tolerated. And that's a different conversation than we've been willing to have. And we need to force that conversation and force it upon our leaders.
Well, I do hope that this is a turning point in that direction. So, Ted, thank you so much for joining us.
Manya, I appreciate it. Since you had asked about hope, I want to make sure that we try to end on a hopeful note, which is that what's been especially striking for me is not the responses from all of the leaders, for which we are really grateful. It's the responses from people, especially young people, especially like the ones that I saw yesterday at Sarah's funeral, who understand that the world has to change and that they have to play a role helping to change it. And to really honor Sarah and Yaron's memory, providing more and more opportunities for young people to play exactly the roles that the two of them were playing on the night that they were killed, where they were trying to change the conversation, to build bridges, to bring people together. That's what has to happen. Those are the opportunities that we have to provide going forward.
Thank you so much, Ted.
Thanks, Manya. I appreciate it.
This episode is brought to you by AJC. Our producer is Atara Lakritz. Our sound engineer is TK Broderick.
You can follow People of the Pod on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and learn more at ajc.org/peopleofthepod. The views and opinions of our guests don't necessarily reflect the positions of AJC. You can reach us at peopleofthepod@ajc.org. And if you appreciated this episode, please share it with friends and family and write a review on Apple Podcasts.